Hello, I am delighted to be with all of you today here at the Bloomberg Technology Summit. Thank you for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed the morning sessions as much as I have. Writers, artists, and musicians are both intrigued and shocked by the power of generative AI services. Will it harm arts and culture or become a vital part of the creative toolkit? Our next panel is going to try and answer these very questions. So please join me in welcoming Hilary Krane, Chief Legal Officer, Creative Artist Agency, Victor Riparbelli, Chief Executive Officer, Synthesia, Oleg Stavitsky, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder, Endel, and Tom Mackenzie, anchor, Bloomberg Television in real life.
Welcome, everyone. And yes, that was the digital avatar version of me, created by the team at Synthesia. We just have been having a very lively debate in the green room, and we're going to help and hope, I should say, to recreate this and that debate on stage. So very pleased to say we have a fantastic panel, as you can see. And I'm just going to briefly get the three individuals here to introduce themselves and what they do. So Hilary, let's start with you. This is all about the creative industries. And I think for most people, on the lay people, when they think about AI, I think the creative industries probably comes front of mind in terms of where the disruption may land. Hilary, you are very much within that world, the creative agency industry, CAA. Talk to us about what you do and some of your clients and how this is folding into your thinking.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Yes, I'm the Chief Legal Officer for Creative Artist Agency, and as many of you may know, we're the leading agency in the world for actors, musicians, sports figures, you name it. We have an enviable client base of many people you know and recognize, and we're leaning into this heavily. Why? Because our clients care deeply, and some of them are on the concerned side of the house, and some of them are in the how quick can I get in and see where this is going to lead me side of the house. It's as diverse a client base as you could possibly imagine, and so we're leaning in to make sure we understand it, that we represent them, and that we can help create the circumstances that will allow this to become a really dynamic tool for the creative industries without becoming an existential threat to them. That's basically the balance we're seeking.
Victor, what is Synthesia? What do you and the team do when you're not having to build an avatar of me? What is the focus of the business?
Well, we build a lot of avatars.
Yeah.
So Synthesia is the world's largest AI video platform. We help the enterprise communicate better with video. So our technology is able to create videos like the one you saw with Tom before. We work with 47% of the Fortune 100, a lot of training, sales enablement, customer support types of use cases, where our customers want to elevate a piece of text into video, which is a much better means of communication. One of the things I find interesting about AI really is that I think it's going to be the great democratizer. In our little world, what you're seeing on the screen behind you right now is how our tool works. And as you can probably tell, it's very, very easy to use, right? Previously, the barriers to creating video content in an enterprise would be you have to know how to operate a camera, how to write a script, how to do all these things that traditionally are really hard and would have to go through a video production department. With this type of technology, we can enable anyone in the company to become a video creator in just a few seconds. If you know how to make a PowerPoint, you'll understand how to use our tools. We're very focused on the enterprise landscape. That's where we put most of our efforts. But I think in general, with creative AI technologies, it is going to be the great democratizer. We're going to see people today who have great YouTube channels, but are pretty kind of simple in the content they can make. They'll be able to create Hollywood-style content, which will create a barrage of new, exciting content. And I do think the biggest impact of the creative industry is going to be less about replacing actors, IP questions. I think it's going to more be a war for attention, where all of a sudden, people who previously just had a YouTube channel, they'll be able to produce much more interesting, much more rich content, kind of like they do in Hollywood, right? They'll create competition for eyeballs, less than they'll create specific questions around how actors, for example, will operate in this new world. So I think a lot of the focus, I think, is a little bit misguided, actually, if you take a 5 or 10 year time horizon.
Yeah, and we want to unpack that in a bit more detail. But before we do that, Oleg, you, the team at Endel, what is the business focused on? What do you do?
Yeah, we have built this proprietary, patented, scientifically generated AI technology that produces functional music at scale. And when I say functional music, I primarily mean soundscapes that are designed to put you in a certain cognitive state, like concentration, relaxation, meditation, sleep. So what our technology does, it creates this type of content at scale. And this technology powers the app. There's Endel, the app that is available across all platforms out there. Download the app. It's the best sleep you'll ever get. Thank me later. But that very same technology is used to produce static, pre-recorded soundscapes that we publish ourselves and with a lot of partners that we're going to be talking about later today on the DSPs, on streaming platforms. So there's Endel, the artist, and there's Endel, the app.
Okay, Endel, the artist, and Endel, the app. Let's get to the key question then, in terms of how disruptive your technologies are going to be to the world that Hilary lives in and the people that she represents. Victor, let's start with you, because you touched on Hollywood. How disruptive is not just the work of Synthesia, but generally, generative AI going to be for the creative industries that is valued at, on some accounts, $14 billion just in the US? And what does that disruption look like?
So I think there's many analogies in history we can look at here, right? I think the advent of computers and the internet enabled anyone to very quickly create text, like write things and share them with the world, right? So if you look at the book industry or even the news industry, right? I think what happened more than anything was that all of a sudden there's a lot more choice for the consumers. And that means that their attention is much more diffuse than just on reading books that have been published by a big publishing house or watching one TV channel that everybody in the UK has, something like that. So I think that's the mechanic we're going to see here as well. I think people are going to be able to produce much more with much less. And I think that's going to be the really big thing that we're going to see with this. I mean, music has gone through the same thing. There was a time where you had to have instruments to produce music, right? I can open my MacBook today and I can synthesize a 65-piece orchestra because we can sample and synthesize sounds. Now we're going to be able to sample, synthesize, types of content that previously you'd have to have millions of dollars of budget for in Hollywood. You need actors, cameras, visual effects. So I think that's going to be on a long timeline, like let's say 5 or 10 years. I think that's going to be that's going to be the dynamic that's going to play out. It's going to enable anyone to create anything that they can imagine, and I think that's a good thing. I think the best ideas are going to win, and I think there's still going to be people who will be way better at storytelling and making content that are in Hollywood and are professionals that have done this for their entire life. They'll just be able to create more and get from idea to a piece of content faster. Okay,
that's a relatively benign vision if you're sitting there as someone who within talent, within movies or music, or the music industry. Oleg, does that kind of align with your vision? How much chaos are you going to be causing in the music industry in the years ahead?
That's a good one. I mean, look, we're already working with a lot of artists, and I think the narrative has changed over the past few years, because we started back in 2018, and in 2019 there was this partnership that we have announced with Warner Music that was mistakenly kind of called, that people said that we signed a recording deal with Warner Music, but it was just a distribution deal. But not a lot of people understand the difference between the two. So basically the headlines were saying the end is nigh, and the algorithm just signed the deal with a major music label. So people were going nuts about this. Fast forward to today, I think there's way less pushback, and actually because we have already worked with a lot of established artists like Grimes, James Blake, Miguel, and others, artists themselves are much more open to actually experimenting with this technology because they see an opportunity rather than a threat.
Are they, Hilary, or is Brad Pitt one of your one of the members of your portfolio, Brad Pitt, Reese Witherspoon, are they quaking in their boots at the idea of generative AI taking their jobs?
So I'm sure it'll surprise you. I'm not going to talk about any specific talent today and what their point of view is. As I said in my opening, I think there's a really wide array of perspectives on this. But our point of view is that this is an exciting new tool of creativity. And I think we should, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. It is here, and it's here to stay, and it's going to move us forward. And just like advancements previously, photography overtaking painting, moving pictures overtaking animation. We've seen this before, and every time you get kind of an explosion in new creativity without killing the thing that went before it. I think what has people concerned here is whether the machines are being trained on information that is legally owned by other people who don't consent to it being used in that way, and therefore are being monetized without their consent and often their knowledge. And then the flip side of that is, I think, something we can all recognize, which is the use of deep fakes without people's consent or knowledge, so that an individual is forced, without even knowing it, to show up in something they would never consent to be in. And so I think he got some issues on the front end in terms of what's being taken in to train the machines. And I think you have other issues on the part that spits it out in terms of whether you're infringing on somebody's name, image, likeness, voice, ability to control their own destiny. I really want to make the point to you that artists say no to a lot of things in their career in order to cultivate who they are and how they appear in the world. And if somebody else can just log into a machine and say, as happened a couple weeks ago, say, let's create a fake Tom Hanks and have him advertise dental insurance, you're doing grave damage to Tom Hanks and a 40-year career of hard decisions. So I think that's where the touch points are. We're not anti this technology. Anything that adds to the creative toolkit is a positive for creativity. And I would hasten to add that real people are still much better at these things. Books written by great authors are much better than books written by ChatGPT, and the same is true of video and maybe to a lesser extent music, but also music.
Ooh, touching a nerve there.
No, it's just that there's so much in music that cannot be individual and is just the exploitation of the instruments as opposed to an individual's voice or an individual's style. That's all I meant by that.
Yeah, but also the question is for how long, I guess, and that's dependent on the changes and the development of the technology. And obviously, when most people think of A-list stars like Tom Hanks, they obviously also think of A-list stars like Tom Mackenzie. And I asked,
yes.
I say that in jest, obviously, and I actually interviewed my digital avatar that Synthesia created, and the responses were using ChatGPT-4. So I think we have a clip of me asking about my job prospects, because obviously I work in the fairly aged medium of TV. So we can, I think, play the clip and see what ChatGPT or my digital avatar had to say in response to that.
Human TV anchors bring unique qualities such as charisma, critical thinking, and adaptability. So, rest assured, I'm here to assist, not to take your place.
Yeah, questionable, clearly, on the charisma front. So I've probably got 3 to 6 months, I think, based on that. Look, Victor, I know that you have views in terms of the questions around copyright and where those lines should be drawn as we look at some of these big models. Where do you think it lands? Do you agree with Hilary that we need to prescribe what is copyrighted, what goes into the models, and what comes out the other end, how we think about that?
So I think there's a very black and white line around consent and your digital likeness. And I don't even think that should be a conversation that we're having. And I think a lot of those kind of instances, right, would already be legal today. Obviously, you should not be allowed to take someone's likeness and produce an advertisement. I think that's a very hard line. We have a lot of safety guards on our platform. Everything is fully consensual and so on. I think where the more interesting question for me is around what are you allowed to train these models on, right? So you have one camp who is saying you're not allowed to put anything that's copyrighted or owned by anyone else into these models, even if what the model spits out is not infringing on copyright. So this would be putting Mickey Mouse cartoons into the model, and then it spits out cartoons of a green frog walking around the forest, right? Where like maybe it's sort of inspired to some extent, but it's definitely not infringing on copyright directly, but may indirectly be. So that's one camp. Then the other camp, who are like the AI maximalists, who will say, you know, this is what humans do, right? We can't make computers blind and deaf and just say the computer's not allowed to look at any content. They just have to have everything kind of intrinsically. So do we regulate what you put into the models and if you're allowed to train a copyrighted material, or do we regulate on the outcome of the models? And that's a very interesting question. I don't have a strong POV. I don't really have a horse in the race here. But that's the thing that's interesting to me, right? When can we say that content created has enough residue of some copyrighted content for it to be infringing on someone's rights? And that's a question that's been around in the creative industry for a long while. Like we were talking about in the green room around, you know, artists who take a chord progression or a melody or a specific style of singing that's inspired by someone else. They sometimes get litigated, right? Someone say, hey, you stole that melody from me. And they get sued and they have to pay up some money. So I think that's the question. And I think the consent question, I hope, is not going to be a question. I think that's very obvious. But I think this idea of like, what can you train the models on is hard. And maybe my last thing to add to that, which I also mentioned before, right? I think the interesting thing with a lot of these new technologies we've seen the last 12 months is that you literally cannot build them without training on extremely large data sets, right? So this would be ChatGPT is trained on like, I think 30% of the internet. Some of these new music generators are trained on, I don't know, like millions of hours of music, right? And so in those cases, it becomes practically very difficult if you have to get permission for every single piece of content. And so that I think that just muddies the discussion even more, makes it very hard. But I don't have a strong POV on what, I can see both sides of the argument, to be honest.
The point you're making is that there would not be an open AI or a stable diffusion if all of that input had to be copyrighted.
Exactly.
And you just wouldn't have those models, and you wouldn't have all the different applications you could build on those models as a result. Do you agree with that, Oleg, that to some extent you have to open the gates around copyright in order to get to the advancements and the innovations that many would like to see?
When it comes to music, there's two types of models that we need to be talking about, right? Like the so-called foundational models, the quality of which is definitely determined by the quality of this large data set that is being ingested, right? Like that is very, very clear. And a lot of these models out there are currently trained on tens of thousands of hours of stock music, and therefore they sound like very, very talented stock musicians, right? Like, so that's the thing. And I think the winner is going to be whoever is going to train the so-called foundational model on tens of thousands of hours of copyrighted material. And that has not happened as of today, right? Like, and then you have kind of specific models. That's what we do. Our model is actually trained on our content that we have created, because that model is laser focused on functional music specifically. So what we do today, right now, the way our technology works is we take the stems from artists, we ingest them into our system, and actually it analyzes it and it creates new stems. Stems are like, you know, individual components of a song, like you have like a bass or vocal or like a melody. And it creates new stems from the source stems, but it sort of endelifies everything it touches, right? Like, because our model is functional music specific. So it really depends on what kind of model we're talking. And I think at the end of the day, what we're going to have is we're going to have these large foundational models for music, and we're going to have genre and artist-specific models.
Interesting. Hilary?
So the whole idea of copyright is that if a creative person creates something and goes to the trouble of protecting it under the law, that they have the ability to control where and how it's used. And we are seeing now the development of models in the commercial sense that are not all the way to where OpenAI are, where people are willing to give indemnities because they're training the models in ethical ways. And they're saying the only thing we're using to train these models is data we have or we've gotten the legitimate rights to. And I think where we're going to see this go is some competition in the models if users can get their heads around demanding that what they use not be based on stolen goods. I completely appreciate that often You can come up with a better product if you steal from other people. Okay, it doesn't make it right. Publicly available on the internet is not the same thing as legally available for use. And so the question really becomes, if these models and the corporations that are creating them are creating commercial advantage for themselves by wholesale using stolen, copyrighted material of other people, are we, as a broad world society, going to accept that as an ethical matter? And then country by country, what are our laws going to do? And historically, we know this, and you don't have it here, but in the US, there's something called fair use, which is if there's a copyrighted material and I want to go make something that is, let's say, a satire based on that material, fair use. I'm doing something new, even though it's inspired by something that already exists. Those are difficult calls to make. We've been making them for scores of years, if not centuries. So I think the fact that it's difficult isn't a reason to throw out what we've all kind of agreed to and is the basis of the laws that exists today. So I think we're going to see through competition whether or not the world cares about ethical training, because law and legislation is trailing technology, which should surprise none of us, because that's always what happens.
Victor, do you agree that competition is going to take place? And do you think the ethics will matter? Or how concerned are you that innovation will be held back if maybe you follow that view around the needs of copyright?
Well, I think, I think the question here is more nuanced than I think the creative industry usually portrays it at. I think, for me, I always think back to, if I sit with 5 of my friends and we just listen to a lot of music from someone, and then we make something that's fundamentally new, I think everyone in this room would agree that that's okay, right? As long as I'm not infringing on copyright. And I think that's the question of, do we view humans as being different than machines in this context? If I have my machine look at a lot of different music and output something, I totally get the argument for it. And it's not because I take a stance for and against, but I think it is more nuanced than just stealing content. I think in terms of competition, I think what we will see with this style of training, right, is that all the value will then incur to all the incumbents, right? Because Getty Images, Adobe, the record labels, they have the data, and they're the only ones who have the data. And maybe that's fair, but that'll 100% stifle innovation, right? Because it means that basically most startups will die on the way to getting there, or they will have to partner with these big companies to get access to that data. So I think, this is a space where there's a lot of incentives, and I think the incentives are also important to be understood. You have the startups who obviously are interested in more open copyright laws, because that will help them, and you have the big incumbent companies who are not interested in it, both because of I think, generally moral questions around it, for sure, but also because it is a means of kind of capture to some extent, right? And I think that's also, I think that the litigation in the US will be very interesting to see how that kind of pans out, and what the courts deem to be ultimately best for society, right? Do we want to have these technologies with a few companies where it's done in the right way? Do we respect that more than the innovation that will happen from kind of like the grassroots style movement if we open up these laws, right? And as I said many times now, I generally don't know what the right answer is, but I think for me that is the kind of discussion that the world is out.
How do you stop your digital avatars becoming deep fakes?
Well, so we have consent in place for, we never create any avatars without explicit consent, right? So you have to literally, sign a contract saying you're okay with your avatar being created. And there's a KYC style process that goes into making an avatar. So for us, I think, again, consent around your likeness, and I also think responsibility for making sure your technology is not misused, for me, is completely black and white. Like, we employ lots of content moderation, AI safety, and we take consent very seriously. And I think that should be the baseline for anything we do with AI. For me, the interesting question, again, is around the training data, right? Because I think that's much more nuanced, and I think comes with lots of different trade-offs. I don't see removing consent as part of any product to be good for the world. Like, I just don't see why that would ever be the case.
Oleg, how much of a threat are you to Spotify?
I mean, I would like to think that to some extent...
You're making them sweat a bit.
God, is there anyone from Spotify in the room?
Daniel Ek is just sitting there.
Yeah. I mean, Look, I think definitely when it comes to functional music, that category on the DSPs, not just on Spotify in general, we all know that a lot of this content is, rain sounds, ocean sounds, dishwasher sounds, and we have hundreds of millions of people listening to this type of content.
Wait a minute, dishwasher sounds?
Dishwasher sounds.
That's a thing?
It's a huge thing, actually. Fan sounds. Yeah, because it's essentially white noise, and it helps you go to sleep. It's just because neuroscience. Right? So a lot of people are listening to this type of content, and what we've seen over the past few years is this category growing massively in this direction, and the major labels have been ignoring this category for a very, very long time. They've been like, okay, that's fine. You want to listen to rain sounds, go listen to that. But now this category is estimated at 15 billion streams a month across all platforms and channels. That is if you look at top 5 most popular, most consumed, most subscribed to playlists on Spotify, all of them are going to be like sleep, deep sleep, concentration, things like that. And a lot of that content is not artist-driven and not label-driven content. So here comes Endel, and we're saying, well, we think there must be an alternative to that. We think there's room for high-quality, premium, artist-driven, functional music that is created at scale using our technology.
Okay, we're going to come back to you in just the next couple of seconds. I'm going to be deeply unfair. We've got a couple of minutes left on the clock that we need to preserve for something, an announcement. But before we get there, I'm going to be very unfair and ask you briefly to give us your views on what an appropriate regulatory response is to generative AI. Hilary, I'll start with you.
Wow, that's a big question.
It is.
For a little time. I think an appropriate response would be to, first of all, legislate and clearly state what Victor was just talking about, is that consent is an absolute requirement. That's not well established everywhere. As much as we like to think that that's a bright line, people are not acting like it's a bright line. So number one, I think that should be the case. Number two, I think we should get clarity on the use of copyrighted material for training and what's in and what's out. And right now, we're relying on the court system to do that. That'll take a couple of years. Probably be better if we got something faster out of the legislative bodies, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen.
Okay, Victor.
I totally agree, and I actually think that the most important thing is just that we get some guidelines. As I said, I think it can go either direction, but right now we're basically letting it up to companies themselves to interpret copyright legislation in the way that they see fit. Some will lean forward and break more copyright laws to get faster ahead on product development. Some will stand back and try and do the more ethical thing. And I think we just need to get the rules in place, right? No matter what direction they go, because that makes the playing field much more even.
Okay. Oleg, I'm not going to ask you about regulation, but I am going to ask you about your announcement and your partnership. Talk to us about the importance of what you're announcing.
So what I was just talking about, right? We are partnering, or have been partnering with artists all over the world to create kind of functional soundscape versions of their music. And earlier this year, we have announced strategic partnerships with Universal Music and Warner Music to work with all of their catalog, I mean, any music that is on their catalog, to turn that into functional soundscapes. And today, we're actually announcing a deal that we're doing with Rhino, which is a Warner Music label. We've reimagined Roberta Flack's iconic song, Killing Me Softly, that turns 50 this year, as 3 soundscapes. And yeah, we get to listen to it now.
Very cool.
There we go. The power of generative AI with consent. With consent.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. I think you'll agree. Fantastic panelists. Really appreciate your time. We ran over by a minute, but I think it was worth it. Hilary Krane, thank you very much from CAA. Victor Riparbelli from Synthesia and Oleg Stavitsky from Endel. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.